In this video, we will talk with Marcus from Datrycs and Tim, that's me, from hygraph, and we will discuss coupling for decoupling. And so Marcus and I will dive into how this all works and why you actually have to couple something to make a decoupled architecture work really well. And the main topic here is to actually talk about how you are going from legacy to a modern infrastructure and how all that stuff with coupling and decoupling actually works. And so in our current space, there's lots of companies actually moving away from the monolith to this decoupled infrastructure. So when you look at the space right now and with your customers, what do you see them dealing with when having their monoliths in place at the moment?
Without calling names, of course, but you see if companies are sticking to the heritage too long and they are capitalizing their IT investments over a long time, mostly they're stucking into that position that they can't adapt. And then a new player maybe is jumping on the market and is launching new capabilities. And those folks with the heritage are not able to adapt the market or the market requirements. So they are not not able to adapt pretty fast on the market, which means that they're stocking to some extent to the old world. They're not able to launch something new because they don't have the data in shape, for example. So if you would like to build up a new app or a new website or whatever, I would say a crucial thing is to orchestrate data to some extent. And if you are not able to orchestrate the data later on because you have that heritage, then you're not able to jump into new opportunities in that case, which leads to that point that they are falling behind the market, and the new guys, or the new kids on the block, are just jumping in and growing that fast that the other ones are still dealing with a legacy. Meaning, if we're calling that heritage, and you're dealing properly with that heritage or legacy, then I would say you're doing a good job. But you have to manage that proactively and don't think, okay, I'm just buying the piece of software today and I will use it over the next 8 years because then we made everything right, because the market is still moving and changing.
So companies that have a rich heritage and have chosen software for their future that is actually holding them back a little bit, trying to maintain this thing for as long as possible without having to change because it's complicated. Can you kind of talk about what that cost of doing nothing means?
Yeah, sure. So you have to think on it on two axes, basically. One axis is the time, the other axis is, I would call it effort or budget in that case. And that means that over the time, the running and changing costs from your current infrastructure, meaning from that infrastructure which has the heritage or so-called legacy architecture, is increasing. At the same time, also the customer and the user expectations are increasing. And assuming that you have a given IT budget, which is not increasing massively, your costs over the time by running and changing that infrastructure is eating up the innovation. So that means customer expectations are rising, your running and changing costs are rising, but you're spending basically your money from the IT budget on the wrong angle, which means you should basically spend the money into innovation rather keeping the infrastructure up and running. Basically, this is the cost of doing nothing, which on the long end means you will fall behind the market.
So everybody in these types of videos and on conferences and on webinars always talking about the market is changing, the TikToks are doing things. And actually, that's kind of funny, right? Because we never go into what that change actually is and why do you have to change? Why do you need to have that quick wish list next week like we just talked about? So Marcus, can you talk a little bit about what you see, what this change actually is, and can we predict it? All those things. So maybe give us your wisdom.
Yeah, okay, I tried to do it. And maybe we're coming from a non-technical angle, or rather from a macroeconomic point of view. And I would say if you have a general look on the market, there is a term which is called VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is actually describing the whole state of the macroeconomic markets. If we are stepping into the V, which means volatility, that means that everything is changing faster changing user expectations on the one side. On the other side, you have volatile traffic peaks on the infrastructure because somebody's launching a TikTok campaign on your website or whatever, and the traffic's just exploding, and everything is leading to a kind of unpredictable future in that case. The second term, which means uncertainty, means that we can't also predict what's happening around us. So we see there are wars on the world going on. We have delivery chains, who are just breaking down, and we're not able to ship the goods towards our customers, which means that's totally uncertain if we are getting that goods, if we have to change it, how we deal with that, etc., etc. And if we're looking at the C, which stands for complexity in that case, everything is getting more complex because we're just adding systems and processes together and try to orchestrate everything towards our users and having a great user experience in that case, which means everything is getting complex in that case, and complexity has to be managed. And the last letter in that case, the A for ambiguity, means that everything has more than one meaning in a kind of context. So just putting that all into a nut, meaning everything is getting more volatile or uncertain in that case. And the only thing what we really can't predict is that everything will change in the future. And that's why markets are changing. That's why user requirements are changing so fast compared to a decade before. And we have to be able and flexible to act on that. But Tim, just being said on this VUCA term in that case, what do you think in terms of a technical point of view? If the markets are changing on the one side from a macroeconomic point of view, what does it mean for IT infrastructures in the future? So what is your point of view on that?
Well, as we just talked about, everything is changing constantly. And it seems like to me, when a little trend happens and you get a spike in traffic and you need to do a certain thing, wouldn't it be awesome if everything was smaller pieces that you can scale up and down without having to scale your whole environment, or add a little puzzle piece or remove a little one if you don't need it anymore? First of all, that's cost effective, right? But then also you're able to quite quickly adapt and add like some tiny piece like this wish listing we just talked about on it. And I'm not saying a wish list is a simple thing to build. There's a bunch of things connecting. But if you have software that's just wish list that you just connect into your current, puzzle pieces, it works really well. So concluding, your infrastructure should be an enabler rather than a constraint. And that's easier said than done, because we all tend to just throw at this thing, make it composable, throw things together. And we'll probably talk a bit later about why that is actually pretty complicated, because you can really code all these things together in one place or in multiple places, or have a system to orchestrate these things. And so, yeah, it's not easy, but definitely we want this thing to be flexible with small pieces that are really great at what they do as that small piece, and then probably integrated with your legacy that you still have, that you haven't changed yet. You don't have to do a big bang change. You can have both.
Okay, get your point fully. And what would be your 4 takeaways on that?
Funny you should ask that, because we actually prepared this. So the first one, of course, is scalability. Scaling a huge architecture that is one big block is a lot harder than scaling smaller pieces. Because if you have just that wish list that needs to be scaled, it's a lot simpler to just put that on the cloud and add more virtual servers and make that happen. And with that comes cost efficiency, because you only scale that one piece rather than everything. And of course, that gives you flexibility and agility, because you can quite easily add blocks or remove blocks. And with all of this together, you get technological diversity. You can even have different teams specializing in different pieces of software with different languages, as long as they are a little, island that an API can talk to. As long as these APIs are solid, everything is going to work. And imagine using hygraph and actually do GraphQL. Then every API is completely unified, transparent, and easy. And you don't even have to know how these other systems work. So lots of cool things within these 4 little blocks here. So now that we've established that we want to do a composable architecture with smaller pieces, of course, there are some ways how you can actually connect these pieces to make it one cohesive architecture. So Marcus, what are your views on how that works, the ways to do it or not to do it?
So basically, if you're jumping into that whole composable topic, you need really a plan how to execute that. Because what we often see is that teams are starting to decouple or get into microservice or composable architectures but you really have an impact on that and you're gaining challenges out of that if you don't plan it properly in that case. And that means on the one side, if you're just connecting all the systems to each other and you get a kind of new spaghetti microservice architecture in that case, you're getting problems on the customer experience, because basically if the data is decoupled and diversified in several data stores, it's pretty hard to orchestrate that unique user experience in the front end and grab the right data set for the right application at the right time, which leads to confusion and loses the trust of the application from the point of view of your ad customer in that case. Most of that is driven by divergent data structures, so that you're not having the data at full swing, because if you're decoupling, then it's getting pretty hard to sync the data properly in that case. Or also having the data schemas aligned so that it's also nice for the user experience in that case. So you have those two topics on that angle, meaning the diverse data structure, which is also affected by some kind of synchronization delays, which is ending up into a bad user experience.
Yeah, and so when we talk about this in a slightly more technical way, we know we have to make it a cohesive architecture, but not couple everything in such a way that it's almost worse than a monolith, because you can't code yourself into a web of troubles. And so there's a few ways we see in the wild how this works. Like the easiest way you can do this is in your implementation, let's say your front end, your website or your app, you just connect to all the services and clean the data from all these places into one bit. That's your front end. However, if you add another channel, you have to do that again. And if something changes, your code is full of stuff that is way too complicated and super smart for what a front end should need, right? So that's what we see most, but at scale, it's just not maintainable. You get lots of technical debt. It's like, how do I morph this API and that one and put them together? That's a piece of code that needs to be unit tested, which will likely not be unit tested. And all that stuff is complex, right? And so we kind of need to find a way to couple that decoupled data that actually makes a little bit more sense, where your front ends or your implementation sites, your phone apps or your websites or your refrigerator apps, all that remains super simple. The simpler that is, the better it works, because you have your data managed somewhere else. And that is what we like to call at hygraph content federation. And in federation, you have a ton of different ways, but the way we like to do it is to actually have a layer in between that aggregates all the data from all your specialty services, like your wish list, like your, all these like PIM systems, DAM systems, they all come into hygraph. And hygraph is a GraphQL API, and we won't go much deeper technically than that, but what that means is hygraph can take over that API and make it a schema that your front end can always query the same way, either in the hygraph CMS or just as a data source that you need from your front end. But that means your code doesn't have to know anything about these specialty services, but just about that aggregation layer. And the way hygraph does it is that it leaves these sources that you have, like your PIM system, like your wish list, whatever, autonomous. So when you scale, you can have specialty people that are really specialist at building like a search index or a wish list, work on that, and then the data goes into hygraph and it stays the same way. And it just caches it on the CDN, and you can change it all the time fast if you want to. You can even do a call from a system to say to hygraph, this is now new data, or it has a 30-second timeout, stuff like that. But that means is you have autonomous sources, and then you have web developers that only have to query one thing. It's all the same. It's super simple. And that's something that we're quite proud of, to have that as a CMS, because it's a pretty challenging thing to nail down. And there are so many ways to roam to get there, right? And especially when you throw in the scale part of things. So now that we've established this technical system with the business system, Marcus, how does that make sense to you when we combine these? What is your vision here?
So if we're not having that autonomy in the middle, then we're just raising the complexity in that case. Yeah? But on the other side, without the unification in that case or a standardization, we have a kind of messed up structure. And in a modern stack, we need both, in my opinion. And if we're jumping a bit more in detail in that topic, I would explain it with that. that you should really focus on content objects. So you should ask yourself from a business point of view, which content objects do I have in my company? There are objects in my point of view, like a product, like a customer, like an order, which perfectly can be displayed in a CMS in that case, and can be federated. And it comes to that point that you realize that those content objects are produced and consumed on attribute level from different systems. So you have, let's stay to that example, like a product. Yeah, you have an attribute like an SKU, which is coming from an ERP, for example. Then you have the description, which comes from the PIM system, and you might have a price, which comes from the price engine, just based on that product object or product content object. And combining all those attributes and federating that data is needed to build up the unique user experience. And I would say this is really the key for modern infrastructure. It's not only for commerce.
So we talked about this content federation thing as a pure data play. You were connecting ERPs to PIMs and things like that. But is there also another significant part of this that influences businesses?
So from my perspective, yes. Content federation is not only a technical project where you're just combining data. It should be started from an organizational perspective, and that means that you should start a data discussion. That means that you have to get all the stakeholders in place and discuss really the data which they need to provide a unique user experience. And then you're coming from a more organizational transformation perspective, rather a technical perspective, where you start the project in that case.
Yeah, I totally get when your organization sits correctly in this with all the responsibilities in the right place, the technical architecture is actually super easy. It kind of just flows together. And what we were just talking about in the beginning of this discussion is that this process and the optics thing is a huge win for all the teams. Having good optics with your leadership and being flexible makes everybody happier. Probably it gets cheaper, and then you can actually get a lot more work done because your whole architecture is more flexible. So it's almost like look at this as an organizational transformation that helps you to be more flexible and your tech will just align. And maybe that with that bombshell, we can almost end this discussion because it feels like we have now figured out how to couple the uncoupled architecture and have a composable approach to your business and the tech, and it kind of all fits together pretty easily. However, it is pretty hard to connect the things, but then you have systems like Content Federation to help you with that. And so what are your last words here, Marcus?
I would say that you really should focus on building a unique digital experience for the customers and not focusing really on all the integration stuff and custom middleware. We learned in that talk that it's super important to have it, but what we see is that people on the market are just starting from that layer and building on top of it. And if they are reaching from that, there is no IT budget left to build that unique digital experience. So I would say there are proper vendors on the market like hygraph, which we can choose to build a unique digital experience by orchestrating all the data and think from it from an organizational perspective and come from that angle. So that's really, in my perspective, the key on it.
Awesome. Thank you for this discussion and enlightening me with all your more business related knowledge. I think we're good to go for this video. Cheers. Have a good one, everybody.
Cheers.